previous segment of our panel discussion on ethnic conflict, we talked in particular about the possible innate psychological roots of ethnic conflict and ethnic violence. Now we're going to broaden the focus and look a bit more at the economic and political dimension. I'd like to actually shift now from the sort of micro to the very macro. You mentioned things like Rwanda, you mentioned some sort of very large-scale arenas in which these things can play out. And Debraj Ray, I think there's a general sense that this kind of ethnic violence actually has increased in the last 50 years as kind of a cause of regional and international human conflict. First of all, is that true, and is there any evidence for that?
Yeah, so I was actually listening to the other speakers with quite a great deal of fascination because it sort of ties into themes at a much broader level. In fact, there's two remarkable facts about social conflict, which is that the first one is that within country conflicts account for an enormous share of the deaths and hardship that we see now. So if you look after World War II, there's been a shade over 20 interstate conflicts. 9 of them have killed over 1,000 people over the entire history of the conflict. Whereas in the same period, there's been 240 civil conflicts, and half of them have killed more than 1,000 people. And the total number of people dead is orders of magnitude higher than what you see in interstate wars after World War II. So that's the first interesting fact, that there's a lot more internal stuff that's going on in societies. But the second interesting feature is that if you try to classify these so-called internal conflicts, some of them would be, class conflict, pure and simple. Even the Hutu-Tutsi conflict can be actually viewed very much as a class conflict. The Hutu-Tutsi is really a Belgian connotation, is Belgian nomenclature for groups that had different amounts of land and so forth. Of course, that kind of nomenclature can harden, as we were pointing out, people could internalize that. But if you leave out even that, you'd see over half of these conflicts are actually ethnic conflicts. So there are several definitions of these. So we're talking about hundreds of conflicts that have taken place, over which, of which over half of them can be classified really as ethnic violence. Right?
Well, how do we actually make that classification? I mean, okay, you mentioned class, you mentioned, and how do you tease those things apart?
Right. So the way this is teased apart is what one looks at is the different groups that are engaged in conflict, okay? And then you see whether an ethnic identifier is being used by one of these groups. So, for example, the Milosevic talking about the grievance of the Serbs would then say that at least one of the groups involved is identifying themselves on a fundamentally ethnic platform. Now, that does not mean that the violence that is happening is a primordial violence. It does not follow from that the groups are actually engaged. In fact, most of my research is dedicated to showing that what we think of as primordial violence across groups is actually economic violence in disguise. So the fact that most of this violence is classified as ethnic, groups actually classify themselves as ethnic, from that it does not follow that there are these basic hatreds. It does not necessarily follow that there are these basic hatreds driving violence. So for example, in the case of the Chechnya violence, you could argue that there is a certain, in fact, all of these violence, a certain amount of intrinsic animosity that has to drive it. I'll give you lots of evidence for instrumental animosity. So, for example, the burning of rival businesses that belong to another ethnic group. If you just hate another ethnic group, why not just attack them at random? Why do we attack? Why do ethnic businessmen attack other ethnic businessmen? Okay. Why do we see certain housing colonies being taken over? So what I'm trying to do, while entirely agreeing with the frame that social psychologists take about the innate tendency for us to form in-groups and out-groups, what I want to layer on that is the idea that economic motives can really ratchet up that effect another order of magnitude. and really harden those lines in a very strong way.
Well, what do you think? Could you? I mean, I think that's very interesting. What do you think is maybe the best example of an ethnic conflict, or of what we would tend to call an ethnic conflict, that's actually an economic conflict in disguise?
Well, I can give you several examples, but let me give you an example from work that I've been doing on Hindu-Muslim violence. Since Indian independence, there's been sporadic outbreaks of Hindu-Muslim violence. Okay, it's hard to tell by looking at the newspaper reports whether this is revenge, whether this is hatred, whether there was a rumor spread about, let's say, a rape, which was then communalized, to use an Indian term, which was turned into a religious issue and so forth. But one thing that comes across, if you look at the data, is that, so what we did was we put together violence data with economic data from the National Sample Survey. And what you see is that in regions where there is a jump in Muslim income relative to Hindu income, those regions are invariably followed, well, I shouldn't say invariably, but followed invariably in the statistical sense by an upsurge in violence.
Hmm.
So this is the connection that you see across the different regions of India.
So,
now, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to see if I could understand how this might fit with the framework that Mahzarin and Richard were talking about.
Sure.
And so would you agree that that economics can serve as another means to sort of identify in-group and out-group? It's sort of class, it fits in with those things? Is that the idea?
But you're right. But there's an interesting difference. So for that, let me go back to Marx. So what did Marx say about violence? Marx said that most violence should be the poor against the rich. Okay, so of course I'm simplifying. Okay, but it's like class violence, right? Now, much of the violence that you see in developing countries today, where class is out there for the taking, right, as a salient construct. Okay, we are the poor, they're the rich. Even though it's there for the taking, the lines are drawn in a very different way. Okay, so the lines are drawn in some sense, sometimes orthogonal to class. For example, Sinhala and Tamil in Sri Lanka, right? Paradox of it all is that these groups, which are being demarcated on ethnic lines, will actually be economically quite similar. They'll both be engaged in the same businesses, or they'll both be workers in the same sector, like the textile sector, or the brassware sector, or the beading making sector. Does that make sense? So I'm saying economic similarities across sectors are often are often good targets of ethnic markers.
I completely would agree that the economic dimension is a very important one that makes for the in and outness of groups to just pop out and be visible and ends up being used in all of the. In fact, you can sort of look at groups that didn't used to be a threat to our economic well-being were perfectly liked, but as they become threats to our economic well-being, we begin to find them threatening. East Asians in this country, feminist women, these are groups of people who may not have been attended to as much, but a certain kind of negativity towards them emerges as we see that they are likely to take the jobs of the people who used to have them, and so on. So I agree with that. But I would like to say that there are many examples when economic differences aren't present, and you still see evidence of this in and out groupness. So why is it?
Sorry, excuse me for interrupting, but that was exactly my point. That in many situations we don't see economic differences.
Yeah.
The markers are created for grabbing, if you like, the larger share of a smaller pie. The reason the pie is smaller is because there's conflict, and conflict is always wasteful. But sometimes you can grab a larger share of a smaller pie and you'll still be better off. The whole point is I'm working off economic similarities rather than economic differences. So
you would,
both can happen, either can happen.
So you would each agree that you don't necessarily have to have economics to have this in-group out-group mechanisms to operate, obviously.
The fact that you have economic similarities across the groups does not negate the fact that the conflict between them is economic.
Okay, I understand.
So, but I do agree there are other cases, I'm sure.
Right. If you start to look at simple things like my feelings towards another group, okay, not violence, but just, and eventually violence, but let's just take, there's no reason for white Americans in one sense, you could argue, to be totally threatened by a group of black Americans who they've largely kept oppressed, but they do. They definitely, and once you start to look at the unconscious prejudices, one of the things, I mean, this may be the largest number of times that Marx is mentioned in but I will say that if you take the Marxian notion of false consciousness, one of the examples of false consciousness that we see in modern neuroscience and in psychology is a very stark difference between people who sit on the top of a hierarchy implicitly preferring their own, but people who sit at the bottom of a hierarchy not preferring their own. Okay? And so now you have to combine this preference for your own and add into that mixture the additional fact that it's usually people who come from privileged groups who seem to show deep unconscious preference for their own, but those who come from more disadvantaged groups do not show equivalent preference for their own.
It's just interesting talking to Debraj there and Mahzarin, because I think it illustrates another point, which is that it's not as simple as saying that similarity is always good. And similarity can often form the kind of the frame within which these conflicts can occur. And as Debraj said, that this can be groups trying to get as big a part of the pie as possible. In those classic studies from the 1970s I was talking about earlier by Henri Tajfel, one of the findings there was that one of the strategies that people were concerned with was maximal differentiation, not maximal in-group profit. In other words, they were less concerned about getting as much as possible of the available resource for their own group, but just making sure that their own group had more than the other group. It was sort of reinforced these ideas that there is this symbolic dimension to group identity as well as all these other dimensions that we've been talking about.